What determines a war today? The direct attack of the vital centers of an enemy.
Well, there's a reason for this lofty calm. And it's the bliss of ignorance. Winning isn't everything, but it's the only thing. In our business, there is no second place. Either you're first or you're last.
And then, if I may use a word which we use in Wisconsin, unless we have the guts to name, we should be taken down from those watchtowers and should not be representing the American people.
Good evening and welcome to of Crest and Creed podcast. I am your host, Ian Alexander. I'm joined today by my co-host, Paladin Noir, or the Black Paladin. How are you doing this evening, Black Paladin?
Yeah, I'm doing great.
Awesome. Happy to hear. We've been on a we've been on a slight hiatus due to just our personal lives and a lot going on in our actual work. And so we come to bring kind of a more casual, fun topic, but kind of near and dear and serious to us. The necessity of fantasy and the importance of fantasy in our world. Fantasy fiction, we could go into video games, go into movies, but the idea of having fantastic elements of which to draw from in our life. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably listened to other podcasts similar to kind of our sphere, talking about the subversion or maybe the war on culture and why this is kind of a big deal. And so today we wanted to discuss the importance of it. I get that it's pretty easy to be like, oh, fantasy fiction, that's icky, nerdy. We read history and deep the philosophical stuff. Paladin Noir, only philosophy and history on these spheres, right?
I'd say that there might be an interest in fantasy from a good number of folks.
I'd say so too. I mean, a joke once cracked to me from one of my pastors when he learned that I like Lord of the Rings. He's like, "Do you like Lord of the Rings?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm a young Christian man. Of course, I like Lord of the Rings."
Yep.
And we can even start there. And of course, one of our last podcast series on our dear scholar C.S. Lewis also dabbled in quite a bit of fantasy. So we can even start there. The necessity of fantasy. Why, to you, Paladin? Why do you think fantasy isn't, we would say, important, an interest, or maybe not vital part, but a interesting part of a society?
Sure. Maybe the first thing I want to kind of just turn back at you is ask you what you mean by fantasy, perhaps. So I'm sure you're well aware of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And in that essay, he has, I think, a line that most people would immediately, at the outset, would think to be kind of peculiar. I think a lot of people would assume that when he says he's talking about fairy stories, that he's talking about fantasy. But he says, well, actually, a fairy story can be the vehicle for adventure, mystery, suspense, or fantasy. So clearly fantasy is kind of its own thing, but then there's this extra setting that I think most people would assume imposes fantasy on something, but maybe it doesn't. So yeah, what do you think fantasy is?
All right, so that's a great topic. Usually what I draw from for fantasy, and I would even break this rule when I associate it with things. I go off of, there's a great essay by an author, Lloyd Alexander. He's of the Black Cauldron or Chronicles of Prydain fame. And he wrote one on high fantasy. Yeah, exactly. He wrote, what's funny is I reread them as an adult. And as an adult, I'm like, I can understand why as a kid I loved these. But so now that I have children of my own, I'm excited when they can actually read those books. But he put it as high fantasy, and he defined it. And I think this would be kind of this is where I would put it. And I know he put some certain characteristics behind it. Like easy one is it's a secondary world. So it's a world outside of our own. So an easy example is like if I Googled fantasy films, right? I know one of the ones that pops up quite regularly is like Wizard of Oz. That would not be considered this because it's Dorothy going from our world to another world. So it's already a world of unto itself that's kind of separate. There's a theoretical basis for certain set things. An easy set thing is in high fantasy in particular, I would argue is set good and evil. So if we do like D&D rules of lawful, chaotic, good, evil, neutral, there's things that are set good, things that are set evil, if that makes sense. Like in his essay, Lloyd Alexander even talks about how there tends to always be a dark lord, right? And so the dark lord is your representation or your manifestation of evil, right? In the Christian sense, when we talk about evil, we talk about sin, often defined as the separation of God or something that's counter God. So in here, the Dark Lord represents the evil. Whereas on the flip side, when you have things like in Tolkien, you have elves, right? And so D&D kind of maybe messes us around where you have elves of certain kind of alignments, but in Lord of the Rings, it's pretty set that elves are the good guys, or elves are good, or representative of good. And so there's other aspects like sometimes there's multiple races or there's multiple creatures. Excuse me. Another one that's in particular is the tone. So like I'm assuming Paladin, you've heard of like sword and sorcery, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. An easy separation is just the tone in of itself. Whereas like sword and sorcery, for the longest time I considered like Conan the Barbarian high fantasy, but that's sword and sorcery mostly because of the tone. There tends to be like almost a medieval tone or gravitas or vernacular that comes through in a high fantasy, whereas in sword and sorcery it's more grit, it's more like it's how would I say it, this is where you get like your guys and with like ridiculously strong bodybuilder bodies on the art, whereas you go and dip into high fantasy, this is where you dip into more like your King Arthur, even though that's of this world. So that's would be for my definition of, I get that's high fantasy, and maybe this can even be a conversation of high fantasy, even though I don't want to abandon your sword and sorceries, or we could even talk about your grim dark when we hit like that's more 40K, but into those kind of fantasy genres. So for me with fantasy, I lean pretty heavily on Lloyd Alexander's essay. Uh, I'm considering, because I know it's nowhere on YouTube, even recording an audio rendition of his essay. So that would be kind of the parameters I'm working with is another world set apart from ours. They're set good, they're set evil. We have things that are the fantastic, as in the magic. There can be different rules for that, obviously. But so what's funny is talking about citing C.S. Lewis and Chronicles of Narnia in there, I would still consider that part of this discussion, but I probably wouldn't roll it into the high fantasy. And maybe that's a controversial, a hot take right there.
No, I understand what you're saying. I think those are really interesting things to consider, and also I think it makes it clear to me why Tolkien separates out the idea of fairy stories from the particular genre that so a fairy story can be any number of different genres there. What you were calling sword and sorcery, I think sometimes people call Sword and Planet because of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And the Barsoom series and stuff like that. And so like, is that fantasy? Is it sci-fi? Or is it just adventure? It's an adventure story on another planet with creatures that are fantastical, but also they have spaceships.
I mean, here's an interesting conversation here. Is Star Wars fantasy?
I think it's closer to fantasy than Star Trek.
Yeah,
Sure.
I would agree, actually. In an interview comparing it, George Lucas came out and said, yeah, this is fantasy, right? So
yeah, I mean it's literally got magic. Just by a different name.
In fact, I find it interesting how so this came up, this is a conversation, I remember this came up with the sequel trilogy. and that scene that's kind of iconic and been memed to death of Leia surviving, getting blasted into space. And this is, by the way, this is not a defense of the sequel trilogy by no means. But what I found interesting was that people tried to err on the side of the sci-fi or the realistic aspect of it. And I thought that was kind of a poor take or a poor argument because, like you just said, it's magic, right? The Force truly is magic. Space is not. Space is the sea in Star Wars, right? It's the means of transportation. It's not. You're not worried about oxygen, in a sense.
Yeah, we don't have like deep explanations of photon torpedoes and dilithium crystals and like how it is that all of these things could actually maybe one day be a thing that we do, and that's what sort of hard science fiction is usually very interested in, is trying to predict how we might one day harness the resources that we have in order to really do the things that are in the book. Whereas fantasy, I think, is much more concerned, fantasy at its best is much more concerned with the human condition as it is, and using a setting and certain tropes in order to highlight and bring forward those aspects of human nature and human relationships that are sometimes in the real world hidden and masked by the deceitful intentions of people or the embarrassment of people.
Like that, this came out. Remember, it kind of comes up every Christmas, but I remember Christmas of 2 years ago, it was rampant on the internet, but the Santa deniers and the Santa defenders. And I know that's it's a great conversation to have. And I know it happens often amongst Christians. And so I'm not going to like accuse how you treat with your children, but any Christian listening to this, but it did seem interesting that a lot of the Santa deniers were your Neil deGrasse Tyson types who are trying to it was more of a ruining someone's day than it was or a disenchantment of someone's day, rather than the ramifications of what it means to have myths in our society. And I do think that there's an element lost when we don't have these mythological beliefs. Like going back to what I said about Star Wars and what you just said right there, there's something lost when we try to be avid. This is how space works, and whatever happened to Leia in that scenario, it breaks it because you didn't do space to the scientific degree you're supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And so that, I think you kind of hit it on the head there with fantasy right there, that this is more about, I think you're absolutely right. And this would be an aspect, I think, of even in Lloyd Alexander's essay, there's an aspect of the human condition that's reflected through our fantasy, rather than trying to get into the motivations of a orc in Middle Earth, where it's like, what are the orcs representative of? Not, oh, how did this race become this way?
Yeah, there's no fantasy. Good fantasy often will eschew. There's bad fantasy that won't do this, but good fantasy, I think, will often eschew the kind of psychologizing of things that, like you just said, tries to rationalize and explain evil by saying, well, they're that way because someone else was bad to them, or to try and make these excuses in some respect. It just, orcs are evil, and that's what they are.
Right. Exactly. What part of this conversation that launched this is one that I often have as a Christian man, because within Christian circles, often the discussion on, especially like we're both D&D buffs and we're well aware of the Satanic Panic history, but the I would say limits of what kind of fantasy we consume. An easy example is I grew up with a lot of kids, and me myself, where we were not, because we were Christian, we were not allowed to do Harry Potter, right? And so this conversation kind of came up to I really wanted to understand this as to why in some people's minds Lord of the Rings made sense and was good, whereas Harry Potter was evil. And a pastor had a great conversation going off with this talk of evil is the question is of itself evil, right? So how is evil treated? What does evil mean in these worlds? And Tolkien truly grasped to be evil in his content, right? And his evil is to be counter good in a sense. And what I mean by good is like in their world, it's Iluvatar, right? In our world, it's very obviously God. And because when we read the Bible, we see like you take a prophet, you take the apostles, what are they doing? They're healing, they're seeing the future, they're casting out demons. And when you look at they're raising the dead, then when you look at evil usages, we could say evil usage of miracles or evil usage of, we'll just use magic for this take, even though it's biblical. The witch of Endor from that Saul visited spoke to the dead, right? But was evil. The snake lady that Paul met who could see the future was evil. And so those were evil, even though they were doing the exact same acts as the apostles, because where they drew their power from or what they were manipulating was wicked. And so Tolkien perfectly flushes this out and how things work, even in the first chapter of Silmarillion, when Morgoth Melkor kind of diverges from the creation of the world. Even Iluvatar says anything within this world is of me and is of my purpose. So even they don't call it, Tolkien never uses the word sin, but even his defiance will be used to my ends. And so comparing that to Harry Potter, you don't get that, right? Magic is magic. And I'll be frank, I never read the Harry Potter books. I'm going off of the movies, but in there, magic's very neutral. And we as Christians know that there's no such thing there. There's no manipulation of this thing that's neutral.
Yeah. So one of the key things that makes fantasy good fantasy is that it's able to bring out those aspects of the human condition that we recognize as true. We can see the reflection and say, that's definitely true. In order for it to do that, it also has to have, as you were saying, a fundamentally true cosmology. And the true cosmology is that of the triune God and the devil. And crucially, in that cosmology, they are not equal powers, right? It's not a dualistic system in which God and the devil are, locked in some kind of immortal combat that, just sort of shifts a little bit this way and that way. And, sometimes one side gets the upper hand and sometimes the other. No, Satan has lost. He had lost from the beginning. But what he is able to do is corrupt, destroy, taint, and in other ways, sort of spoil what God has made, but only in a kind of secondary way, right? Satan doesn't create his own minions that are completely creative, completely new, completely apart from what God already has made. All he can do is twist and corrupt, and so that is a crucial aspect of getting the cosmology right. Is that you have there is a God who is good. There is a Dark Lord who is evil, but the Dark Lord is not the equal. I'm sorry, did I say Dark Lord who is evil, but he is not the equal of
You said it right.
the God who is good.
Precisely. So this is where we're hitting in kind of the crux of why this is important, because as you brought up, it reflects this, it points to it, it shows us this. And so it's interesting that Tolkien, maybe not interesting, maybe it's obvious, but that Tolkien is kind of the standard for this stuff. And I don't know, I'll be honest, I don't know if anyone's been able to replace that when it comes to the definitive good, as you brought up. And so an aspect of that is, that I like you brought up, is proper definitions of evil. Because in this day and age, even in our fiction, we don't really seem to have a true reflection of what's evil. right? We can define things that are sin. Like we break it down to like what rules, like you don't do this, you're sinning. I'll be honest, I haven't really consumed a lot of modern media lately, so I can't think off the top of my head a representative of this. But the idea that here's the set rules and then you break it, so therefore you're evil. And then we also go into the done to death trope of the sympathetic villain. And what's interesting enough, the last kind of big iconic villain I think in our art was probably representative of Thanos coming out of the Marvel universe. And it was fascinating that that's the first time he was not sympathetic in the slightest. In fact, his moral mission that he thought of in himself was evil and was only ever treated as evil throughout the whole narrative. And so that representation of evil is, I would say, like going back to Lloyd Alexander's essay, important for high fantasy. Orcs are evil, and maybe this is what separates it from Sword and Sorcery, because I do love Robert E. Howard's Conan, but Conan's morally gray, like very morally gray. His god Crom, very morally gray. And this, I guess I forgot where I was going here. Thoughts on that, I guess.
Sure. Thoughts on Crom and the morally gray, or thoughts on Thanos?
We can
Either one.
Pick it apart. Yeah, either one. Just how about like pick apart like this sympathetic villain trope?
Yeah, right. Okay, so the sympathetic villain is, I remember that was a thing that really became bigger and bigger in my younger years in the 1990s. And of course, now Disney has done a whole bunch of movies where it's like, let's take the princess movie and flip it and make it all about the evil character, and how the evil character actually had reasonable motives for whatever reason. And I haven't watched any of these, but what's going on there is our own culture's breakdown in its inability to understand what morality is. As we get further and further away from just a basic ability to listen to our own consciences, which are not perfect, certainly, but as we get further and further away as a culture, as people are more and more taught to just drown out their culture, or their conscience with, I don't know, sometimes dark things, drugs, alcohol, or just with dissipating themselves in sin of one kind or another, it becomes harder and harder to even understand what good and evil actually are for people. And as a result, you get these stories that have fantasy tropes, but they're misusing all of them. And they begin to want to see the villain, the traditional villain, as somebody who's maybe just misunderstood, or somebody who actually had a point, really, or any other way of sort of justifying that evil behavior, because of course the mind that's not controlled by the spirit is always going to want to try to justify its own evil.
So do you think I've often thought about this too, do you think our reflections of these sympathetic villains, or these definitions of villains that are contra what would show up in like a Tolkien or a Lloyd Alexander, do you think this is an aspect of us trying to downplay? I wouldn't say us, the creators or modernity trying to downplay our own sin? Do you think it's our lack of understanding of sin? Or do you think this is, we could say, at a propaganda level being pushed on us, that we try to downplay what is evil?
All of the above. Yeah.
As always, it's a mixture of everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly it is a form of self-justification. It is certainly coming from a place of ignorance, and there are definitely people who would prefer that we think this way, for sure. Yeah, because it makes people who are, as I said before, dissipated into sin, are much easier to control by. There's the old story of how Steve Jobs didn't let any of his kids use any of the technology that he created. So
Yeah. So now that we have a kind of a villain established and a good and evil, other aspects. So the other world. So why is it important to? And I have my thoughts on this, but why is it important to have the other world? So why is it important to have the Middle Earth or the Prydain that's outside of kind of the main sphere of our reality in order for it to be? We can change this podcast about high fantasy, even though I think sword and sorcery could be thrown in here too. The other world going on there for a fantasy.
yeah, and this is like a key point in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories essay, in which he says that the key thing that makes up a fairy story is that it takes place within the realm of fairy. So he spells it differently than fairy. Fairy would be, I don't know, we might think of like a sprite or a pixie or something. But fairy is like Faerie, and that is like a kingdom. Okay. And Tolkien's conception of this is similar to the way we might think of the kingdom of God, almost, in that while there may be a region or an area, a geographic place that is more dominated by fairy. Fairy can intrude anywhere, right? It's not necessarily bound by lines on a map. And now he also says, interestingly enough, that the important thing about fairy isn't so much the elves or the dwarves or its other inhabitants, but the interactions that we human beings have with it and what that signifies. So why is this secondary world important? Because it is the device by which it lays bare those aspects of human nature that fantasy and similar stories are trying to surface in a way that is sometimes hard to see in real life. So in real life, we might look at a person's life, career, trajectory, what they did, and we might have a lot of questions about them. Let's take a somewhat controversial figure like Richard Nixon, for instance. You will find people who say that actually Nixon was a great president and he really tried to do some good things, but then there'll be criticisms of this or that or whatever, right? And of course, the main narrative is that he's just a horrible person. But if you were to write a fantasy story where Richard Nixon is a character, not by name like himself, but like you took everything about him and made him into a character in this other world, you would more easily lay bare, right, the truth about who this person is if you could get to the bottom of it. But of course, that's the issue, right? Is that it's never quite that easy to get to the bottom of it in real life. And what attracts us to fantasy is that people cannot hide behind the sort of subtleties and contradictions of things.
Precisely. It's to me, this happened. This is a conversation, and it still happens over creations of things like the show The Chosen, of Christ and the apostles, and taking away any kind of political background to that I think is involved in there. But the idea of trying to take the Bible and then, in a sense, humanizing the characters or drawing to it. And I feel like that's such a waste with in the reverse, where you take like a Lord of the Rings or Tolkien in his work, where he creates his world set from the moralities laid down from the Bible. Kind of like what you said, you can now, and there's some debate over allegory in fantasy of if there's allegory, does it still fantasy? But that you can take the understanding of today, such as like modernity, where there's, and that I would believe there's strong allusions to the threatening of modernity in Tolkien. And so being able to display that and get to the crux of that, almost kind of like what you said from the human aspect, because like take your Nixon example. Maybe it's not necessarily Nixon himself, but maybe it's the energy given from Nixon's administration that can be reflected in this second world, like you said.
Yeah, that's what you'd have to do for sure. Mhm.
Yes, yes. So it's like, and one of the praises that we often laud to a Tolkien or a C.S. Lewis is that they've actually experienced combat. So you see kind of the horrors, the stresses of combat or war in itself reflected in what's going on in their fiction. And so the second world, like maybe to kind of in my little less sophisticated way of saying it, it's way that you can play in this world in a sense. You can articulate these kind of messages you're trying to bring. And so when you take like an example is like Tolkien with elves, he can play around with what's a, because we can't do this today. Imagine what a race of beings that can live 3,000 years, what their kind of culture and their teachings and wisdom they can bring out to us, versus like today we have the oldest we can have is 80 and the wisdom of that. So we got the villain, we got the world. Let's talk about some heroes. What's something of like the heroes that's separate from like a sword and sorcery or maybe your gritty detective novels, or like a fantasy that's something similar to like vampires showing up in our modern day? What's the heroes of a fantasy that's important versus these other heroes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the sword and sorcery or sword and planet guys, usually you might have a protagonist. Edgar Rice Burroughs' protagonists tend to be this way, where they're kind of driven by certain almost instinctual principles of right and wrong. At least they're expressed instinctually, kind of. If you analyze them, I suppose you'd say they would just be reflective of kind of the American spirit at the time. But they're sort of animated by these deeply held principles, but they aren't really they're not really fighting for like a greater cause in the abstract, you know. So John Carter arrives on Mars and he's just kind of like, wow, what's going on here? And he's interested to learn a little bit. I'm sure, this part of him wants to get back home, but then he sees the way the Deja Thoris is being treated and he's like, this is not right. I've got to fix this. Right. But it's not about some cosmic struggle between the green Martians and the red Martians. It's just like, I don't like the way they're treating this one woman because they shouldn't do that. And so that gets him caught up into events that are larger than himself. And then if you compare that with something like the high fantasy of Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, then what you're looking at is baked right into it is the sense that this is about the ultimate struggle between good and evil. Mm-hmm. And this is like a huge debate going on right now among people, and it has been really for about 10 or 15 years at least, is should every fantasy story be that way? And I actually agree with the people who say, no, they don't all have to be that way. And that's a whole nother, like we can get into that topic. But that is certainly the kind of thing that sells multi-volume book series.
Right, correct. Like just going off that, every Conan book, it's like he's either escaping the law or he needs a job. So it's like a lot of the kind of 2 hours of reading is Conan's on a job and he experiences something, and then afterwards, it's over. Or like one is he's escaping, he ends up on a ship because he's running from the law, and the ship takes him on his adventure. But yeah, and pulling back from Lloyd Alexander's essay, like he talks about how the fantasy hero, just to quote it, the fantasy hero is not only a doer of deeds, but he also operates within the framework of morality. His compassions are great as his courage, greater in fact. He might even consider that his humane qualities more than others, or that are what the hero is really all about. And so I think you hit it on the head where we read your Sword and Planet, Sword and Sorcery, comparatively to your Tolkien, where those are, you could say, human, or like human drives, right? Like you brought up with John Carter, it's he doesn't like how a woman's being treated, or Conan's just trying to do a job. Whereas in like your high fantasy with Tolkien, and I would agree with you that I don't think fantasy needs to be all this. I think there's elements to it. I think what's lost is that we don't have these figures that are of something extra. Um, something that has quite happened a lot is, shouldn't say quite happened a lot. Something that's lost, especially in certain like spheres of church and Christianity, is a loss over these saints. Like maybe a saint to us is once a year we celebrate St. Valentine's Day. Once a year we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. But I think in modernity, it's really hard for us to comprehend human beings who, while they're being persecuted or martyred, are in a way thankful, are at peace, are praising God, are praying, which is what happened to a lot of these saints that have holidays. And so within these books, like you take an Aragorn, and Aragorn in the movie, for most of our Tolkien readers, is very different than Aragorn in the book. Aragorn in the movie, he's reluctant, he's more human, right? He's nervous about would he turn evil. Aragorn in the book is so representative of something else. It's something of what you could say, I don't even want to downplay it with what I'm about to say, but a good godly government, or a good godly, what good godly authority looks like. And so in the book, he's very on par. All right, I'm going to return to the throne. And so within these fantasy books, and you're right, I don't think they all need to, but I don't think we have really a fantasy book that can articulate that as well since Lord of the Rings, or maybe C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, I think part of what attracts people to Aragorn in the books, rightly so, is again, it's that sort of pure fantasy of the those aspects of the human condition laid in a much more bare way. And so Aragorn is not conflicted. Aragorn is not complicated. You know, I understand why Peter Jackson might want to like do that in the movie. I didn't like on its own. I don't find it to be a terribly offensive thing. That, of course, the whole story is about people being corrupted by the power of the Dark Lord. So I can understand why you might want to have this element of, you know, Aragorn's worried about that corruption from a different angle. You know, of course, it's not the way Tolkien wrote the character, so it's a little bit of a travesty that they did it. But I can at least understand it. Where was I going with all that? I'm not sure.
Well, so what's funny is I was going to juxtapose this because I think what they do, comparatively to the book, you take like a Boromir character who is more representative of what happens when man falls. Like that's his kind of purpose there. They give the same treatment to him in the movie. And that's where I actually think the movie is. I'm not going to say better than the book. I'm not going to say that because the book is something else entirely than what the movie was trying to portray. And I'm not even trying to poo-poo the movie either. But the Boromir in the movie is more representative of, I think, a better representation of your conflicted man, of your man that's at his end. And this goes into your point that not all fantasy needs to be the iconoclast, right? But that he's a man at his end. He's on his last, he's seeing his civilization fall. He's seeing, in this case, it's someone close to him, his father, contribute to that fall. And you see the ring test him. There's a part in the movie that's brilliant where you see, it's in the Council of Elrond, where he's feeling through, you can see the ring feels through everyone in the audience, and it finds Boromir and it finds his weakness and it grabs onto him first. And so you see him try to reach out to Aragorn in hopes that he comes back to be a king. And once Aragorn denies him, that's when you see the ring truly consume him. And then we have that iconic scene where he tries to take the ring from Frodo. And so there's an element of that treatment that I think is good. That is, in a sense, I'm very conflicted with which Boromir I like better. because of, I get his representation in the book, but I like how it's portrayed in the movie, that this was a lost man, and how sin can so easily creep up on us when we are so lost.
Yeah, I try not to get caught up in the sort of never-ending wars over, was the movie good? Was it a, not good? I just appreciate each one for what it is. I think the movie's good enough to just love it, and it's okay to like it.
It's okay to like movies. So it is. It's okay to like movies and video games, believe it or not, Paladin. It's okay to like video games.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we're drawn to a close kind of soon. We have our heroes, we have our villains. And I think the resounding theme within these is that when it comes to certain aspects of this, there needs to be a representation, and they tend to be towards the good, right? Or what's contra good. And so why fantasy? We could wrap this up with our little our own opinions on this. Why fantasy, now that we've kind of defined our parameters? Why fantasy and not a Western? So why is the presence of dragons or magic in here important or vital or interesting, counter to why I couldn't just do all this with like a Western?
Yeah, in some ways they share a lot of things. You certainly do have, some of the, how does human nature come out in an environment where there is no central authority to keep everyone in line. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of the fundamental thing of a Western, is the idea that the only thing keeping people civilized in a Western is if they will be civilized, right? And of course, in a Western, there's always the the rustlers, or the bandits, or the maybe it's the Indian tribe or whatever it is, right? That introduces the aspect of the forces of chaos, seeking to either destroy or pull into chaos, right? The budding civilization on the frontier, and elements of that are going to make it into fantasy. But what makes fantasy apart is this idea of human beings as like sub-creators, that when you interact with the world of Fae-Ree, what you do, whether very explicitly, like you're casting magic spells, right, or implicitly, like what humans bring into Fae-Ree as themselves being a sort of foreign entity, right? It affects and changes the creation around them, right? And so, in his essay on Fairy Stories, Tolkien talks about this as a really important aspect of the whole thing, right? That as human beings being sub-creators, that our creator made us to also create, not out of nothing like him, right? But to create. And, you see that in the fact that we are artistic beings, writers, for instance. And so in fantasy, you can sort of exercise the will either very directly and explicitly, or even implicitly, upon the world. And so and then the world reflects what is the character of this will that is shaping me, right? Is it an evil spell that is being cast? Is it a good spell? Good spell. Think about that one. Is it if it's not a spell, is my foreign entrance into the world of Fae-Ree, does it bring about corruption, or does it bring about healing and goodness? These are just things that you can do with fantasy that you cannot do with the Western.
Yeah, precisely. What's funny is that's almost not exactly, but spot on, kind of pulling from high fantasy and heroic romance, which is what the essay from Lloyd. Whereas there's something extra special where we witness these heroes overcome something titanic, right? almost like you brought up, like fighting an Indian, we all, or a native, whatever it is, we may all have an ancestor that's done that, or in our lives, right? Like getting over, you have a confrontation at the bar or a confrontation with someone in real life. Reading that, there's elements of that that's useful, but the fantasy important is that there's more gravitas to the understanding of witnessing someone overcome a titan or a giant or a dragon. And so dealing with these larger than life beings or dangers and reading about them gives us an extra element or an extra appreciation or understanding when it comes to overcoming our own kind of monsters, right? Be that something in the physical or be that something in the of ourselves, right? Our temptations or our sins or our doubts or our stresses.
Yeah,
And
and
so, yeah, go ahead.
it's the recognition that, of course, we are not the only creatures in creation with a sentient mind, and our struggle is not against flesh and blood, right? But against the dark powers and rulers of this world. And so, yeah, we absolutely have dragons to fight and demons to banish, literally. And so, fantasy, again, it just lays all that bare. In a sense, fantasy is almost more real. It's like a hyper reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. All right, I love this conversation. This is great. I love this. Thank you, Paladin. I'm going to leave us off with a little excerpt from Lloyd's essay. The logical question is, what makes fantasy so memorable? Unfortunately, art is not always susceptible to the logical analysis, or at least not to the same patterns of logic that apply in other areas. Instead of provable answers, we have possibilities, we have hints, we have suggestions. The most obvious answer are the least accurate. Fantasy can be considered an escape from the complex reality to a more simplistic world, the yearning for a past that never existed, or a vehicle for regression. Attractive as these answers may be, fantasy offers no such escape from life. It can refresh, it can delight, certainly give us a new vision, make us weep or laugh. None of these possibilities constitutes escape or denial or something more of us begin to suspect at a rather early age. The being alive in the world is a hard piece of business. So, as he parts there, it's not just, it can be, but it's not just pure escapism. It's more like what you reflected. It reflects aspects of us that we can, witnessing a character overcome greatness and ascend to greatness. So I appreciate this talk. Appreciate your time, Paladin. Thank you all for joining in, and we'll hope to speak to you next time. Thank you for this talk. We're signing off. Thanks.
Bye.